All right, guys, how are we doing today? Steve Mingleco, Final Web Design. Today's video, I want to review a video that is talking about the collapse of the U.S. tech industry, give you my thoughts as somebody who's been in this field for about 15 years professionally now, and just kind of review the state of the U.S. tech collapse with you guys. So let's get into it. Final Web Design, this is Steve. All right, guys, so here we are. I'm going to get into the video. I'll stop it and kind of go over the pieces as they come together.
Is in chaos. Almost all of the major big tech companies are collapsing. For example, Meta was worth over $1 trillion in 2021, but just a year later, and their value has dropped by 2/3. And the other giants aren't far behind. Amazon, Meta, Twitter, Tesla, and Netflix have all seen massive revenue drops, and the scale of these losses is
So, I don't think that this is a big surprise. Everybody knows currently that there's been a huge layoff in the tech industry from all of the big tech companies. Everything, I think it started with Twitter, Microsoft, Tesla, Uber, Salesforce. You name it, these tech industries have been laying off people. And as you saw there, it said 250,000. I'd be surprised if it's not even more. So let's kind of continue and see why this is happening and what's about to happen here in the future.
Unprecedented, especially considering big tech has been so unstoppable for the last decade. In fact, revenues and profits were skyrocketing. Silicon Valley was a billionaire factory, with some of the most prolific billionaires building their names and their bank accounts on the back of big tech companies. Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Jack Dorsey, all of them were created by the massive tech boom of the last 4 decades. But then the bubble popped, and now the biggest names in Silicon Valley are seeing their revenue plummet, firing hundreds of thousands of employees, with the stock value of almost every big tech company falling dramatically. Which leads us to the question, how did it get this bad so quickly? Well, you see,
So that question about how did it get so bad so quickly, I have pretty good answer, and it's multiple different factors, and I think we're going to get into that as far as more detail. But you got everything that just the market was flooded. There was too much money for cheap labor, and they were trying to just hire as many talents and work employees, tech employees, as they could for most of these big companies in the early 2000s and around the COVID period. So let's go into a kind of where things are at now a few years later as the industry's progressed.
tech was a growing part of the world's economy for years. Over the last decade, tech companies have only got larger and larger. And of course, there were ups and downs. For example, the dot-com crash of the late 90s proved the catastrophic consequences of overvaluing tech companies. However, over time, the industry always picked up again. It was a measured climb at first, but soon people forgot the mistakes of the past. And as the years rolled by and technology improved, the companies behind it grew richer and richer. But there were massive problems on the horizon for Silicon Valley, because the path wasn't all golden. For example, companies like Uber have coasted on their potential, hoovering up investments without a proper model for profitability. The same can be said for Twitter, and yet despite this, all of the
That's what I always find so funny is these huge American tech corporations that aren't even technically profitable. I know, the stocks and the value and the investments, and there's a lot of pieces that go into a business, but at the end of the day, when you see a company like Uber that's probably doing millions, billions of dollars a day in transactions and they're not profitable is a pretty telling sign. But it does take investment to get these things going, and it's not a small app.
giants of the industry grew to immense proportions on paper. For example, in 2018, Meta surpassed $500 billion in net worth, and Amazon were closing in on $1 trillion. But all of these companies had a similar problem. They just weren't worth what people thought they were. Their business models were shaky and in constant need of investment, or they just didn't make that much money to begin with. Their margins were always incredibly tight, and that's why almost all of these tech billionaires never look at the stock price.
That whole period is very interesting because the stock is not the company, and the company is not the stock. And so as I watched the stock fall from 113 to 6, I was also watching all of our internal business metrics. Every single thing about the business was getting better and fast.
Because they believed as their technology spread into every aspect of the world, the companies would always ride the wave of future potential. Their shaky business model just didn't appear to be an issue at this point. All these big tech companies were gaining more and more power, and it seemed like they were untouchable. Because big tech had something invaluable, the eyeballs and data of the entire world. You see, ever since they started...
And I think that's really what a lot of these companies have become, whether it's Google, whether it's Facebook. They're getting your data, they're getting your information, they're tracking where you are, they're viewing the pictures you let them view, they're getting as much information as they can. So these companies haven't just become a service, but they've almost become a data mine, which has become more valuable for governments and other businesses and marketing and things like that. And I think that's where we've really had to take a little bit of a cautionary step here, because they're gathering so much data, all these big companies, and that's where they're really focused. I mean, the profits are one thing, but the data is invaluable.
Pulling in user data at the massive levels they do now, social media companies were then further driven to maximize their engagement, keeping people on their app for as long as possible, and often as possible became the most important thing, which is why we're all so addicted to our phones and our laptops. It makes all of these big tech companies billions of dollars, allowing them to sell more and more ads and exploit more and more of your data. And over time, these companies perfected this process by manipulating psychology, making the apps so addictive that the entire world couldn't live without their smartphone. And during this process, they found out that anger and fear are some of the best ways to keep people engaged. And so as the algorithms were fine-tuned for engagement, they pushed more extreme and more provocative posts above.
Gosh, isn't that true? When you get onto your social medias now in the last few years, just how much of this like provocative material they show you, whether it's people fighting or, you know, politics, or it really goes into a whole like new place with social media. When it started, it was a lot of like, hey, let's connect with friends, let's chat, let's see their pictures from the weekend. And now it's become like, as you can see in this screenshot right here, so much political. You can see a picture over here of I think it's Hillary Clinton, but irregardless, it's just like they put a lot of provocative stuff out there that they know, because they have the data, that is going to kind of trigger you or keep you engaged, keep you coming back, make you digging down that rabbit hole. So yeah, you gotta know what's targeting you these days.
Everything else, putting them in front of everyone's faces constantly, all while censoring any information that didn't fit into Silicon Valley's political narrative. Which is why Twitter, Meta, and all these other companies became the breeding ground for social media addiction, censorship, and hatred. And as time went on, the cycle ramped up and the culture war worsened. And these changes in the online space were reflected in the real world, leading to riots, unrest, and collapse. It didn't matter to the tech companies.
Who remembers those times? Maybe the early 2020s when a lot of this was brewing over, whether it was the social issues, whether it was the global pandemic issues. I mean, this was just a time where social media really took things to the next level. And again, it's because they're able to target and trigger and get that information to the people's minds who probably don't need it, because they know it's going to engage them, keep them on longer, keep them going again down that rabbit hole.
Though. In fact, this was in their interest. And instead of tackling the problems that they had caused themselves with their algorithms, companies started to then lean further on censorship, suppressing all counter opinions in the name of misinformation. But this solution wouldn't work forever. Tech companies were going to pay the cost for their meddling in public discourse. However,
you know, this gets me to a thought of when they took away the down thumb on the YouTube videos, because it was giving away the sense that like people, you'd watch these specific videos and there'd be 100,000 down views and 100 or 10,000 up, and you're like, well, that's a 10-1. Nobody's really getting this. But at the same time, in the public media, this is what they're pushing you. So I remember that was one feature where I was like, yeah, they're really trying to like hide the manipulation of all this social media and what they're triggering people with, because when you go in and you can see that nobody's agreeing with it, with the down likes, it really kind of stood out. And they took that away for a reason, which I think we can all agree was because they can hide the situation easier.
For now, they had to deal with a much more conventional problem: competition. Over the past decade, China has exploded into the technology industry. Companies like Tencent, Huawei, and ByteDance have been eating into the Western market share on a global scale. In fact, Tencent has made numerous takeovers of Western companies like Riot, Epic Games, and even Ubisoft. And through these moves, they've undermined Western dominance in the lucrative gaming industry, with China owning some of the most popular games today like Fortnite and League of Legends. And China's also taking over with things like TikTok and Tencent's investments in Reddit and Discord. And then Huawei attacked hardware manufacturers, releasing cheaper alternatives loaded with Chinese data collection technology. Xiaomi did the same, but to even greater effect. Despite only being founded in 2010, they've gained over 12% of the market.
Yeah, so this is something I've obviously been very aware of, is these Chinese tech companies that are coming out with their own hardware. Not only software with things like TikTok, but the actual hardware, the phones, the computers, the laptops, the iPad or the pads, tablets. So what I've always been concerned about, and here in the United States, we don't have this issue as much because we buy a lot of U.S. products, or Korean at the least. Apple iPhones, things like that, Samsungs. But a lot of the third world, Latin America, Asia, parts of Africa and stuff, are using these Chinese products because they're obviously cheaper, But at the same time, I don't think a lot of these people are aware that the Chinese government or the CCP has access to this data. I mean, this isn't even like a hidden thing. They're pretty upfront about it. So whatever they're gathering for your data that these other companies in the West, like Google and stuff, I mean, these Chinese hardware and software companies are definitely digging in and getting all that at a government type level. And I think that's where we got to really see what happens over the next few years, because some of these companies, like Huawei, I believe it said, I don't even remember them 10 years ago. And now if I leave the United States and I go to a mall in another country or something, you see these stores open. You see them in the U.S. too, but definitely more prevalent for the economic situations in other parts of the world that people use these. And you got to be careful because that information is going right to the Chinese government.
Already. And ByteDance is probably the most sinister. I mean, China was well aware of the disruptive powers of social media long before the West had any idea, and they studied what the Western companies were doing with engagement and turned it into an art form, with TikTok exploding in popularity by playing on Silicon Valley's addictive business model. And by learning from Silicon Valley's successes and mistakes, TikTok has grown by 400% every single year, seizing Western social media companies' audiences from under their noses. Which is why...
TikTok grew fast, but it's like any technology. I think it's going to kind of have its wave. It's a new thing, and eventually, a new product will come out. People move to that. It's what it is.
Almost every major app has now adopted TikTok's short video model. And to put it plainly, this is a targeted attack on Silicon Valley. All these companies have incredibly close relationships with the CCP, which has given them enormous room to scale up. Because no matter how profitable these companies are, they've always got the Chinese government behind their back. And this gives them a massive advantage over the West. They don't have to deal with pesky human rights laws, ethical impediments, or even profitability. Instead, they can be safe in the knowledge that as long as they pull the party line, they can get away with virtually anything. And this isn't just within China, this is everywhere. They get government backing abroad, as all of these Chinese big social media sites are practically a third party of the Chinese government. And as they work in tandem, these companies have become an unstoppable force. And so whilst the Western tech companies are always at each other's throats, China's tech giants have been allowed to build their monopolies in peace, which is why every day China gains a little more ground on the West. Because for every user and customer that China gains, Silicon Valley gets weaker. And this new threat has been awful for big tech's bottom lines, and the true consequences have only just begun to...
I mean, there's obviously some truth to that, but at the same time, we do need some global innovation in other parts of the world than the United States. I wish Europe had more, tech companies. There's some reasons, I think, for that. I wish the rest of Asia had more tech companies outside of, China, that was producing. Japan's obviously a big tech producer, but it's not so bad to have a little bit of Silicon Valley going to the rest of the world. I mean, there's still a huge market there, and again, a lot of Westerners aren't going to want to use these intimidating products from other countries that they don't trust. So it's not a big deal. I don't see that as being the big issue, really. I see more going into the next things that just the market got out of control. People were getting employed that didn't need it. So
today. But they hadn't affected the numbers yet. Apps like TikTok were only just getting started and massive growth was still expected. And by the end of 2016, some journalists were hailing Silicon Valley as the future. They said this because something dramatic had changed. The list of the top companies used to always be dominated by oil and manufacturing, and a few financial giants that relied on their sheer scale to dominate. But these companies had now been replaced by Google, Amazon, Tesla, Apple, and Microsoft, pushing out the old guard. However, despite their immense valuations, these companies still weren't nearly as profitable as they should have been. From 1995 to 2015, Amazon only made $2 billion in profit, despite the company approaching $1 trillion net worth. Now yes, this move was meant to dodge taxes, yet it still portrayed a significant disconnect between Silicon Valley and the rest of the world. Rather than focusing on profitability, Silicon Valley companies were much more focused on growth, and the best example of this is Uber. You see, Uber spent years focused entirely on growth above anything else. They embodied the Silicon Valley mantra, breaking laws in industries to cement themselves in the market. With a massive leak showing that Uber executives were shown instructing their employees to use chaos and violence to uproot the taxi industry and put pressure on governments. And of course, they had big problems with actually making enough money. I mean, their business model still has incredibly low margins, even after they started to squeeze every penny they could and raising all of their prices, which has caused Uber to be in a worrying situation. With market saturation, their stock price is plummeting. And
I find that very funny. I know that this video is a year old, but how can a company like Uber that, I use basically every day, not every day, but I use it quite often. And, I give them probably a couple $100 a month. I'm surprised that they can't find a way to make that profitable, whether they have to increase the prices or, again, downsize the company. But that's pretty crazy. They've been around a long time.
The company's dreams of market dominance are now fading into the ground. But Uber does still have a slight chance, as Silicon Valley overconfidence has led to way more destructive collapses, specifically in the case of WeWork. In early 2019, WeWork was seen as an innovative new company that was set to change the world of work. Although it was founded in New York,
If you learn
Gosh, that was the
even
funniest
a few
one too.
new data
Is the
skills,
WeWork.
you'd probably
If you know
make more
anything
money.
about that
And
story,
who doesn't want?
the Silicon Valley mentality had
it
definitely
just
gotten
blew
to its
money.
founder, Adam Newman. The charismatic CEO was so good at convincing investors that he pulled in billions. And only a few years after its founding, the company had raised over $1 billion for their office space company. And I say office space company, but WeWork was still listed as a tech company. And so WeWork managed to raise over $1 billion for the company.
Right, this is where tech company became a Regis, renting an office room. There was no tech involved. It was simply a rental, short-term rental. To say WeWork is some tech company, this is where things kind of started getting spun out of control. It's not a valuable tech company. It's another Regis that's been around for a long time.
And this was despite mass layoffs at the company and poor financial performance, because simply enough, investors were just in love with the idea, rather than the products in front of them. In fact, WeWork lost over $2 billion in 2018, and yet the hype continued. Analysis stated that the company was now worth over $40 billion. This was more than giants like Airbnb, and by September, the company attempted to gain even more investor money, beginning the process of an IPO or initial public offering. And this would open the shares of the company to the public, raising even further billions for WeWork. And yet even with this enormous amount of investment, the IPO started to gain scrutiny as investors started to see that the company was really making no money, and it portrayed the true reality of the Silicon Valley business model: massive debt and low revenue propped up by other people's money. And so
And that's what you gotta think. Think of all the expenses, renting all that space, furnishing it all, getting somebody in there, employees to clean it and maintain it and check people in and out. And all you're doing is renting. I mean, when I go to WeWork, I'm spending like $50 for the day. I mean, it's money, but it's not like, it really didn't all add up for the expenses that you see with something like that to what, the costs are. Probably why it didn't work out.
their $40 billion valuation was cut by 3/4 in a matter of days, resulting in 20% of the company being fired. And Newman, their CEO, and other executives were all forced to resign, and the company was forced to cut back on its massive growth plans. Reality hit the company hard, and today people are questioning the expiry date of WeWork. But yet again, Silicon Valley didn't learn from this example. Despite the very same business practices being used across tons of tech companies, this was just seen as an isolated case by tech elites. Besides, now wasn't the time to consolidate and slow down. And then as 2019 came and went, the world was forced into the pandemic.
First U.S. case has been detected. There's confirmation the coronavirus.
Oh, I don't even want to get into this anymore. I'm so over it. But at the same time, this obviously destroyed businesses across the world. For the tech industry, though, it was a booming time. I had so many offers, and people just like, please come work for us. I mean, it was a pretty good time as far as work was concerned. But for most small businesses, this just destroyed them.
Has reached Australia.
And it was here that tech companies would double down. COVID-19, as it was for so many other billionaires and corporations, was a massive opportunity for big tech. The pandemic saw tech companies' values rise by hundreds of billions. They made so much money, they barely even knew what to do with it. And it was the belief at the top of these companies that this is just how things were. Tech dominance into the future seemed all but guaranteed. Zuckerberg and others would be risky and short-sighted in their investments, assuming that revenue levels would stay strong after the pandemic. And that's why Meta's workforce grew by 28% in just a year, and Amazon massively expanded their own operations, seeing their profits soar by over 220%. Apple spent an extra $90 billion just buying back their own stock during the pandemic, betting an amount worth more than the GDP of Sri Lanka on their continued success. You see, tech companies made massive investments into themselves, betting that the good times would never end, and it was this overconfidence that meant that when their profits finally did start to slow down, they wouldn't be able to cope with it. But overconfidence wasn't the only problem that worsened during the pandemic. You see, the culture war was getting more and more intense as people spent more time online. Unwinnable arguments raged as people's lives got measurably worse. And whilst the pandemic was lucrative for tech companies, they were some of the only winners, with lockdowns completely destroying the economy.
That's what I just said. The tech industry, it's been the best thing ever for the tech industry. I haven't been to the office since technically all this happened, because that's when we went into this new world where people are working remote, where our teams are everywhere, where we're able to, not go into an office anymore. So yeah, it was completely destructive for all the brick and mortar businesses, the restaurants, the tourism, the hotels. But for the tech industry, this was a golden era, and it's still kind of, as far as changing the rules with the offices and stuff, has never really kind of returned. But the jobs now are nowhere near the same as what was happening during this period.
Putting millions out of jobs and businesses out of business. And it's impossible to measure the negative effects of the pandemic on people and their mental health. However, what was measurable was the heating up of the culture war. And eventually the result of this would be social media fatigue. People were just sick of the culture war. And China was now also closing in on Silicon Valley.
Yeah, wasn't that true that whole period with all the social unrest? It was just like, I just had to shut it all off. I'm just like, I'll do my marketing on here, but everything else, I'm just keep it away for now. It was just too hot, at least if you were in the United States. It was a very tense time, and all of this was being perpetuated through social media. If you walked the streets or went to a there was no social issues as far as like day-to-day communications, but when you got on those apps, it was just like fire going everywhere, trying to put them out or trying to keep them going. So yeah, that was a time to kind of get away, and I think that's when the whole social industry is really taking a big turn into more of not just friends and family and keeping up to date, but more like just politics and business and advertisements and all these things that people kind of got on there to get away from.
As over the pandemic, TikTok grew by hundreds of millions of users, surpassing 1.1 billion in 2021. However, all of these combining factors hadn't affected big tech yet, but it would only be a matter of time. Meanwhile, the tech billionaires were enjoying their moments in the sun. Jeff Bezos spent millions on a personal space trip, whilst Elon Musk became Time's Person of the Year for 2021. But all of this would turn out to be some of the last good news these tech billionaires had, as once the world finally opened up again, it signaled the end of Silicon Valley's boom, even if no one believed it. For example, at Meta, revenue growth had risen to over 50% in the summer of 2021, but it dropped sharply over the next 9 months, falling to just 5% by the first quarter of 2022. Amazon also saw a sharp decline, from over 40% to around 7% in the same time span. Even usually stable companies like Microsoft or Apple suffered the same fate, seeing their growth levels fall off. So what happened here? Well, all of the growing problems that Silicon Valley thought they could ignore were finally making their mark, and whilst they had been shielded from the pandemic recession by artificial demand, that was all over now, and the economy was only getting worse, so people...
Yeah, that was a tough time. Still hasn't really come back.
Less on products. People didn't care about ads. Essentials became more expensive, so people had less disposable income. Services saw a boost as well, as people made up for the lost time. And on top of this, the culture war had burned tons of people out as well, leading to less usage of social media. A Canadian survey found that less people were using Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter in 2022 than in 2020. And the only tech company that was spared from the decline was TikTok. Their growth was unimpeded, maybe because they're artificially propped up by the Chinese government. But it was clear for everyone in Silicon Valley that they were losing their audience's attention. And with this dramatic reduction in attention came dramatic cuts in their profits. And this is when the crack started to show. Tech companies had become so focused on growth that when it dried up, it hit them much harder than other industries. Over the course of 2022, tech companies lost more and more money, leading their CEOs to make some erratic decisions. Musk took over as CEO of Twitter after years of negotiations and legal battles. He started off by firing large parts.
So this is where I think the change really started in the downfall. When Musk took over Twitter, among other elements that we kind of discussed, he right away, as somebody who knows JavaScript, he knows frameworks, he knows programming, he's read the books, he's done the projects, he's been in there hands-on. He knew right away, once an application is built and launched, you'd be surprised. It takes a team, but it takes a small team to maintain and kind of update it going forward, because you're not building the whole thing from the ground up. You're just maintaining and maybe adding a few new features over the course of your uploads. What I'm saying is this time was when we saw firsthand that somebody knew what was really going on. Because I remember even working like with some of the big healthcare providers, some of the universities, and it's like what they were doing was just silly. I mean, they would have teams of people creating new CSS frameworks or CSS classes. It was just like, why do you need this? There's already Bootstrap. There's already a million other things you could currently use that people know. To create your own internal is just a waste of time, money, and I'm sure it never even got used after we built all that stuff. But there's just little things like that. You saw it kind of coming, and you saw it was just like, I mean, everything was the nicest. You could get the nicest stand-up tables, the nicest monitors, the nicest computers. I mean, it was just a lot of money going around those places. At least at this period. This was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. So let's see where things go with Twitter, because that site's still up. It's running great as far as I can tell.
Parts of the workforce, leading to massive technical glitches and problems with the app. Things were going so badly that he was forced to resign from the company. Google had put much of their focus on their new Stadia cloud console, but as with every other big tech company, 2022...
Stadia cloud console. I knew that wasn't going to make it. Why? That was quick. I haven't seen that in a few years.
Also saw its demise, being forced to refund everyone who bought it without Google actually getting the products back. Additionally, Uber saw a sharp decline in their business, to ruthless competition, massive leaks, and higher prices. Meta stock value dropped by around 60%, with Tesla's dropping by 70%. So once 2022 was nearing its end, tech companies realized it wasn't going to get any better anytime soon. They needed to cut costs, which is why you started to see articles of these big tech companies firing tens of thousands of workers. Like with Microsoft firing over 1,000 employees, then Stripe, a growing startup, letting go of 14% of their workforce. Elon was forced to lay off nearly 4,000 people from Twitter, with Meta following shortly after, laying off a further 11,000 people. Amazon cut their numbers by 10,000, and all of this has happened in just over a month. Eventually, Amazon...
That is so many people losing their jobs. It is insane to think where all these people have gone. The industry had changed. It needed smaller amounts of people. The jobs are still out there. There's still plenty of demand for tech industry. But as far as these big companies, they've thinned down, and they're really cutting every cost, and they're making sure that their employees are being responsible for the pieces that need to get done. No more slacking around.
Double their numbers in December, as clearly they hadn't shrunk enough. And these weren't minimum wage employees either. They were both high-skilled and incredibly expensive employees. And in total, over 1,000 tech companies fired over 150,000 workers. But Silicon Valley had made their bed with their risky investments and growth-focused ethos. The same companies that had fought over these workers in the talent wars, which was just a year or two ago, were now letting them go and incurring massive costs in the process. And it wasn't just going to cost them at the time either. These firing sprees represent a massive amount of people with incredibly valuable skills. A job board called Tech Jobs for Good has seen massive increases in skilled job seekers off of the back of these layoffs. People who have seen the fast life of big tech companies are now instead looking to make a difference despite a small hit to their paychecks. And this is one of the ways in which the collapse of big tech will inadvertently benefit the world. But perhaps this is symptomatic of a much larger trend in our economy. As going into 2023, with the UN predicting we're going to be in a massive recession, it seems like Silicon Valley can only expect more and more suffering. The future looks grim. Ad buys are low, which has hurt all of the social media companies like Meta, and supply chain issues are now threatening hardware companies like Apple and Microsoft. Governments are also now souring on big tech, seeing their influence as destabilizing. Microsoft's $69 billion acquisition deal for Activision and Blizzard is being debated by monopoly watchdogs around the world. The FTC has already tried to block it. Meanwhile, the whole tech industry is waiting for another court verdict on recommendation algorithms. Google is being sued for recommending videos made by terrorists, which then incited an attack in France. And if they're found liable, this will upend years of legal doctrine stating that digital platforms aren't responsible for what people post. The results of the case will dictate what's allowed for years to come and will possibly cripple companies like Google and Meta. It is very clear to everyone in the tech world that 2023 is going to be the true test for these tech giants. And so far, only a week into the year, and Amazon has already...
So yeah, as you heard, going into 2023, what happened and what happened the first part of 2024? More layoffs, more cuts, more job losses. So that's kind of the end of the video, and I'll just kind of give my 2 cents here. I mean, we are in definitely a different period than where things were even a few years ago. I still think that this is a great industry if you know what you're doing, if you know more than just code, if you know how to work with a business, if you know how to help with their social medias, their graphic designs, their video editing, not just the website, maybe some SEO. If you can put all of these other skills to use, I think that this is still a very great market. Now, if you're going to try to go work at, YouTube or Google and say, hey, I'm going to, have a career out of this for the next 20, 30 years, that's just not the case. Get in there, get those big 6-figure incomes, get the good benefits, have fun with it, but don't look at it as a career forever, because obviously you can see how quick this stuff changes. Always have other options. That's what they used to say, starting your own business or having some type of entrepreneur is always a very dangerous thing, but really in these times it's almost safer than having a 9 to 5 job, because unfortunately 9 to 5 jobs are not what our grandparents or parents had. I mean, they really will cut you in a moment, as you can see here. So guys, with that being said, I hope you like this video. If you could give it a like and subscribe, this stuff helps. And if you have any questions about the industry or about the skill sets needed, let me know in the comments or give us a call. I'd love to help you. And guys, with that, we'll catch you in the next video. Take care. Peace.